screen. There we are. Thank you, Ken. No, that was absolutely right. You got my introduction perfectly. Can everyone hear me okay? Is there any chance of a thumbs up or a nod in the chat or something like that to confirm? But I'll carry on regardless until someone says it. Right. So my intention today is to give more of a case study really about the development of Tamar Grow Local over the last 15 years since its inception in 2007. The interesting thing I think about Tamar Grow Local is it's been developed with a conscious reference to systems thinking and in particular models of panicky and particularly the adaptive cycle and the way in which well, we basically borrowed wholesale from that model and created a local food organization which operates at various levels. So first of all, though, I want to give a bit of history about the Tamar Valley, which will become relevant by the end of the presentation, I promise. So that map there is of the river catchment of the river Tamar. So anywhere where water falls on that land, it ends up in the river, flows down the river to the city of Plymouth. For those of you who need a bit more geographic reference, that's a map of the UK. We're in the southwest and we're right on the border between Devon and Cornwall. And the Tamar River actually forms most of that border. There's within the river catchment, there's around 270,000 people, 250,000 of them live in Plymouth. And so for the food producers of the bioregion that is the Tamar River catchment, that's obviously a particularly attractive customer audience right there in the city of Plymouth. However, Plymouth does have its own challenges, which we will get to. The river valley is beautiful, for one, but it's also angled particularly well to catch early morning sunshine. And what that means is that the lush soils of the Tamar Valley get a 2-week earlier growing season than many other parts of the country. And this has been used to particular local advantage over the centuries. Although it has to be said, initially, the activity in the Tamar Valley was one of mining. And there are lots of old mine works in the area, particularly tin, arsenic. And the population growth in the area was due to the mining activity. When mining started to wane in the 19th century, people started to look around at other opportunities. And the recent rail network linking the valley to London meant that they could move produce overnight by train. And at that point, from the 1850s onwards, they took advantage of the microclimate to grow market gardening produce. The mining activity dwindled, but some of the elements of that activity were actually used to create market gardening land. So there are accounts of dynamite from mining activity being used to clear trees ready for planting of the first crops that went in the ground on the valley slopes. The first crops that were flagship crops for the area were soft fruit, particularly cherries and strawberries. Strawberries were particularly popular right through until the early part of the 20th century. And then a disease went through the whole crop on one side of the river. It was the red core disease. And market gardeners were then forced to consider what to do. Were they going to try and find other sources of income, or were they going to try and rework their market gardening constellation of activities around a new flagship crop? And they chose daffodils. Daffodils grow particularly well there. You get the early season, you can ship daffodils up and down the country by rail. And so the flagship of the market gardening changed from soft fruit and strawberries to daffodils. Instead of a decline like we had in the mining era, a decline in mining, start of market gardening, it became a decline in strawberry cultivation, but still within market gardening, still within the same sector, daffodils coming to the fore. And we also had the emergence of cooperatives at this time. We had early 20th century cooperatives around soft fruit so that market gardeners could battle against the jam making factories in order to raise the prices that they received. And then there were also cooperatives around daffodils and other vegetable products at the time throughout the 20th century. The last bona fide cooperative finished in the 90s with a turnover of £1 million at the time. That's quite a good amount of money. And there were various reasons why it went into decline. One is overseas competition. Another is rising prices of fuel locally. Another is the reduction of the rail infrastructure. And just a difference in the way that people started to source their produce from going to markets to going to supermarkets. And it went into a spiraling decline from the mid-70s onwards, finally ending in the late 90s. When that period of market gardening ended, the infrastructure that was bound up within that sector got reused in other parts of the valley. And by that I mean that the pack houses got converted into holiday homes and houses. The 2-acre plots that people were market gardening on had bungalows built on them, and they became houses with large gardens rather than productive spaces. And the infrastructure for packaging and distributing, in particular, market gardening produce was repurposed into a wider housing market. And this has similarities then with the change from the mining era into market gardening, as the market gardening era finishes in the mid-90s, moves into more housing development, commuter belt, people going to work in the city of Plymouth. And this all has some bearing on the design of Tamar Grow Local, I promise. Right. So Tamar Grow Local itself is what's called a community interest company, which is an interesting legal structure. It's kind of a halfway house between a charity and a normal run-of-the-mill company. The main difference is that it has what's called an asset lock, which means that all the equipment and assets owned by the company cannot be liquidated for the benefit of the employees or the directors. And if the community interest company were to go under, then its resources and assets would be redistributed to another community interest company with a similar remit. And that's very important when it comes to sourcing funding, because funders like to know that their investments are not going to be lost. So Tamar Grow Local was set up in 2007. It grew out of the transition towns movement, and so the focus very much at the time was on peak oil and on food insecurity, but food insecurity in the sense that in the future there may be disruption to supply chains. And the emphasis was around self-provisioning through growing your own. And the organisation was set up essentially to hold the lease of an area of land which became an allotment site. Now, allotments, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's a small area of land which you can tenant on an individual basis and grow food for your household. And this was proved quite popular. Within a couple of years, Tamar Grow Local was managing 2 allotment sites, one in Plymouth and one in the village of Carlstock, and had been offered another area of land to do something for the benefit of the community. So by 2011 then, Tamar Grow Local is a community interest company with a couple of community-oriented food projects and land and scope to grow. And the directors, who are all voluntary, sourced some funding from the National Lottery to employ somebody full-time to take forward the organisation and grow the network of food initiatives that we were able to support. So that was me. I started back in 2011, left an academic job and became a practitioner and enjoyed it very much. So those are pictures of clearing an area of scrubland that had been market gardening and was now being turned into an allotment site. There's a shed there which was in disrepair, and that was rebuilt and has become a communal space for what is now an allotment just off a roundabout in Plymouth. So in the years between 2011 and 2014, we as an organisation were able to start around 22, it's a difficult number to hold down precisely, 22 different community food initiatives of various scales. The idea was to create a lot of engagement in local food production amongst the local community, to kind of build a groundswell of momentum really around local food production, but also to improve people's familiarity with what it takes to produce food. And we had to do things which appealed to people's level of time commitment that they had available. And so an allotment, growing your own food on an area of land, perhaps an eighth of an acre, that's quite time consuming. That takes 2 days a week in summer to actually manage. And we recognized that there are a lot of people that wanted to get involved in some aspect of local food production, but didn't have that level of time available. And so we created other opportunities for them to get involved. We created produce cooperatives to bring together producers of different goods under shared labels. But primarily we did community food initiatives, and we started community orchards, which don't require that much time commitment, maybe 2-3 days a year. We started livestock cooperatives. There's some lovely pigs there. They were brought up as one of the generations of a pig cooperative called Pig Society. And this was at the time when the government had an initiative called Big Society, so it's quite amusing. But the other things we did was livestock cooperatives around chickens, both for eggs and for meat. Field scale vegetable growing, so sharing resources out of a field with collective work on the field to make everything grow. We started beekeeping courses, we started community apiaries, we started a whole host of things. And I shall move on to another slide to kind of give you an idea. The picture there is of a field scale growing system, which was on 6 acres at the time. It had about 80 members. We would cultivate around 40 different varieties of vegetables, and everyone could take what they needed from the field. The benefit of having it on such a scale was that it was 2 fields in the heart of a community, and that there was no divvying up of the crop according to surface area. So people could just basically take as much as they liked. We planted 1/4 of an acre of potatoes, we planted an acre of peas. There was no shortage. And whatever wasn't harvested was then sold locally to kind of reduce the entry fees into the community group. So we did similar kind of projects across the board, starting community food initiatives, apiaries, orchards, livestock cooperatives, community growing, and importantly, community supported agriculture, where you're working with existing local producers to share risk of production, so that the customers will perhaps prepay a portion of something, be it a crop of vegetables or a portion of an animal for meat. And in return, the producer will get money up front to de-risk their investment, but they will provide it at a lower than market rate, but higher than wholesale rate. So they're getting a guaranteed market and everybody wins. It's not a zero-sum game. Well, I guess the only person that loses out in community supported agriculture are the distributors. So next slide. When we started the community food initiatives and were looking at the landscape of small businesses in the area, we recognized that, looking at the Federation of Small Business Statistics, 50% of small businesses fail within 2 years. And the same was true of community groups. And this was brought up earlier by previous speakers, that the lifespan of community businesses and community initiatives can be particularly short. And often when you're embedded within those projects or within those businesses and you're particularly identifying with them, you don't scale out to actually look at what's going on. So it's often viewed as either a failure or a success. And with a kind of more biological analogy, perhaps some trees grow to becoming huge, majestic specimens, but some do not grow quite so well. But in the end, all of them will fall over and rot, and their nutrients will be recycled. So perhaps if we look at small businesses that start up and fail in the same way, perhaps we can learn something that can improve the durability of the sector as a whole. And this is where our focus on the adaptive cycle from systems thinking and Panicky in particular comes in. Rather than thinking in terms of a business and a community business in terms of its linear growth, going towards either success or failure, we look at it negotiating its journey around this loop. It starts off in the reorganization phase as an idea, and it draws together elements of previous systems to create a new idea or a new business opportunity. And during the R phase, the exploitation phase, the elements are brought together into a new business idea. At this point, the idea is fluid and there's flux, and it's really resilient because there's nothing really to lose. And over time, it starts to develop, and the business will go through its, hopefully, occupying its vitality window until perhaps a point where its processes become concretized. They have a particular process of doing things, payment structures, particular groups of clients, particular markets that they supply. And that's entering the conservation phase, where perhaps things get a bit more brittle and resilience starts to reduce. And in order to be successful in the longer term, organizations and businesses need to be able to adapt at this point or disintegrate. And if they disintegrate, then their constituent elements are released like the nutrients of a rotting tree into the ecosystem to be rebuilt into something else. And we saw this in the history of the Tamar Valley that I mentioned earlier. When the mining era ended, the elements that were bound up within that were released and then repurposed for market gardening. So the dynamite was repurposed, but also the labor and the land and the infrastructure, the rail links were put in to transport ore initially. So you can see how the constituent elements of a previous system of organization can be reorganized into something new. When the red core virus swept through and wiped out the strawberry crop on the south side of the river, the constituent elements of that market gardening system were then reorganized into a new market gardening system, a rebirth around daffodil cultivation, which is a different system of organization completely, but making use of the same constituent elements in terms of land, labor, infrastructure, and knowledge. And what we wanted to do as an organization, as Tamar Grow Local, was to create the environment within which we could improve the longevity of community businesses, but also recognize that when they failed, that was the natural way of things, and we could then repurpose the constituent elements of those businesses into something that would still remain within the sector, that would still remain around community food, rather than becoming a housing estate, for example. And that's what we're going to do. We looked further at the adapted cycle model and noted that you get organizations operating at different scales with different time periods and different lengths of lifespan. And these can be roughly sorted into kind of this ideal model of 3 tiers. And we just borrowed wholesale from this model and decided to create a 3-tier organization which could have the most impact possible in the local food sector. So in the lower level, and low is not meant pejoratively, you've got this small and fast life cycle, small and fast turnaround within that niche. And that's primarily, we see that as being community food initiatives and small businesses. They're small, they're fast, they may have short lifespans, but they're innovative. And this is where all the new practice comes from. And you have to provide this space for new businesses to innovate. And then hopefully you can learn from the successes. But you can also, as an organization that exists on a longer time frame, remember for them and help to put assets in place for them to develop. So within the Tamar Grow Local system, all the assets are held at a longer time frame level. So we have a tool equipment bank is probably the best example. We have an equipment bank where each of the community groups do not need to source their own stringers or mowers or 2-wheel tractors, whatever. They can borrow one from Tamar Grow Local's equipment bank, so they don't actually have to source it themselves. And the same is true of areas of land which we hold. We don't hold anything permanently, but we don't own any land. We rent it all, but we have it on long-term leases. And we can hold that lease, and if the community group comes to the end of its lifespan, we can instigate another one to make use of those resources in the same space. Importantly, the smaller scale businesses and projects need to be small enough to relate to be able to generate those intangibles we were talking about earlier. They need to be able to actually create local networks which are meaningful for the people who engage in them. At the mid-scale, you need to have something that is going to live a bit longer than the small-scale businesses and hold the assets, but it still needs to be relatable to. And then at a larger scale, perhaps an organization with more of a strategic overview and a longer time frame. So we've tried to create that as Tamar Grow Local. And going back again, the first thing we did after we set up the small-scale community food businesses was to look at ways we could network them and improve their longevity. We did a lot of beekeeping training initially and created a lot of beekeepers, which was initially very good, but then suddenly there's lots of competition at the gate for selling honey, and the price starts to drop and it goes below cost of production. And suddenly you've got lots of irate people that you've got into beekeeping who can no longer sell their honey. So we created a produce cooperative around honey. We brought around 40 beekeepers together. We grouped them together under a shared label, but we don't mix the honey. It's purely traceable right back to each individual beekeeper with a separate label on the back. And so by bringing them together, we have greater volume and continuity of supply. We can access markets that they're not able to access individually. So we can access markets in Plymouth, which they might not be able to access if they've only got 20, 30 jars. And so we have a number of retail outlets in Plymouth that we supply with honey, and we also supply some of our other routes to market which we've developed. We did a similar thing for apple juice, although the two products are very different. Apple juice, the apples that go into a bottle of apple juice, we believe a wine bottle size bottle of apple juice, the apples only amount to around 15p of the cost of that apple juice, and the bottle itself is around 35p, whereas honey is completely the other way around. But we have a lot of small orchards in the Tamar Valley, each of them housing diverse communities of local varieties, many of which only thrive in the valley because of its maritime environment, and don't do well in the National Fruit Collection in Brockdale in Kent. And so we were keen to support local orchard keepers to keep their apples. And so we set up a juicing cooperative which would buy their apples and turn them into juice. We can accept a variety of different apples rather than going for a single variety. And we make a point of mentioning that in our strap line, which is always different, always delicious. That's a departure from what other juicing operations do. They strive for uniformity. And that means that they cannot source apples from all kinds of orchards, particularly small ones. Another thing we did was we created an artificial price floor for apples. So the market price of apples varies hugely. When Crimea was first annexed, the price of apples dropped dramatically because a lot of apples from Eastern Europe entered the market locally, and the price went from £200 a tonne down to £40 a tonne. We still paid £150 a tonne that year and have continued to do that as a minimum ever since, because it costs around £100 to harvest a tonne of apples, and the orchard keepers need some money to maintain the apple trees. The market rate is now up to around £225 a tonne, and that's what the co-op pays for apples now. We also have a route to market for other local producers. We started off with a small market stall, but then scaled up to an online farmers market using the Open Food Network software. We now work, oh, this slide's out of date. We now have around 60 producers on our food hub. It's an online market, very similar to an online supermarket, but each of the producers manage their own profile. They set their prices. We, as an organisation, add on a markup of 18% on the price that they set, which, because of the difference between a markup and a commission, it works out that the producers, the primary producers, get 85p in the retail pound for everything that they sell on the platform. And we can only do that because we also have dry goods which we source from Essential, an ethical wholesaler, organic wholesaler, and we put a 30% markup on that. So the markup on the dry goods subsidizes the markup that we put on the fresh produce. And this means that the food hubs provide an excellent route to market where producers don't have to engage in marketing or distribution, can concentrate on production, which is what a lot of them like doing. And because essentially it's all pre-sold, so they line things up on the shop, people shop and fill their shopping baskets on a Wednesday morning. We close the shop and then aggregate the orders, send it to the producers. The producers then get a list of everything they've got to bring to us on a Thursday afternoon or a Friday morning. They do that, and then we pack it into boxes and take it out for delivery on a Friday afternoon. That means that there's no wastage, and we don't hold any stock more than one night, so we don't have to factor in the cost of wastage, which means we can again pass on more of the margin to the primary producers. It works very well. Our current product lines are well over 2,000, although some of it's seasonal, so it's not really an accurate reflection of how many product lines that we have available at any particular point in time. So going back to this model, we can see that we've got a first tier level of community food growing initiatives, incorporating local producers in orange, because they needed to go somewhere in between that and the second tier projects, which are longer lifespan projects which hold assets which have been bought by funding and which enable and extend the longevity of the projects which they support. We've also recognised that one of the barriers to growth of the online food hub was a lack of local production, and getting into market gardening is particularly difficult because of reasons of access to land. And so we started a Farm Start project, which is a farm incubator program. We rent 12.5 acres of land on a long-term farm business tenancy. We divide that into areas between 1 and 3 acres, put infrastructure on it, including polytunnel. They've also got access to off-road parking, electricity, mains water supply, underground undercover area for packaging and processing, and shared equipment, including a 2-wheel tractor, rotavators, mowers, all sorts of things. And so the idea was to de-risk the startup of a horticultural business by providing the access to land, access to markets, and also the infrastructure around that. That's working really well. We now have several market gardens, a vineyard, and an orchard on site. The vineyard I might end up talking about in a minute if I have enough time. Also mindful that mindful of food sovereignty, and mindful that we wanted to get fresh food to people who need it as well, rather than them relying on largely processed food from other food sources. We partnered with Plymouth City Council to deliver a project called Grow, Share, Cook. This project is now in its 9th year, I believe. And essentially, we provide a bag of around 5 kilos of vegetables on a fortnightly basis to people who've been referred to the project by food banks, by the Financial Inclusion Service from the local housing association, or by other sources, including GPs. We provide free vegetables sourced primarily from local producers or local organic growers. And initially when we set up this project, we were encouraged to look at surplus food from supermarkets as this would be a route for that. And we railed against that because A, we didn't want to tidy up their supply chain issues, but similarly, we didn't want to, we wanted to buy the food locally and give premium quality stuff straight from the field. And that's what we're able to do. And we can do it at the same or cheaper than using food from surplus food networks. So that's been a particularly successful project. But what it allows to do, in addition to the benefits for the recipients in Plymouth, and we can see there 89% of people reporting improved cooking skills and 85% of people saying they had a healthier diet. We're able to buy that produce from our starter unit tenants and local producers in the Tamar Valley, which gives them a guaranteed market every fortnight, half a ton of vegetables we need to put into this. And that de-risks the transition from growing for your own veg stock scheme to starting to grow to wholesale. And that means that where the market has failed to incentivize that transition because of the efficiencies of regional wholesale markets, we are able to fill that gap in the continuum and incentivize people to scale up from direct sales into more wholesale growing. So this is part of that whole sector ecosystem of projects to enable greater food production. So Tamar Grow Local as an organisation could look like this model with its 3 tiers, with the green level being its fast turnaround, often short lifespan projects, with its mid-term layer of things which improve longevity for the other projects, and with Tamar Grow Local acting as a strategic body over the top. But this diagram, it looks hierarchical, and it really isn't. This was originally conceived as a Venn diagram, which was impossible to draw, so I had to split it out into various levels, because there's so many interactions between different levels of the model. For example, an individual beekeeper might want to use the honey extraction equipment of the honeycomb, and they can do that by engaging with the honeycomb. Once they've extracted their honey and put it into jars, they might want to sell it individually on a food hub and derive the income directly themselves, or sell it in bulk to the honey cooperative, which they can also do, or sell it direct from their farm gate, which they can also do. If it goes to the honey co-op, then the honey co-op can sell it through the food hub on a retail basis, through our wholesale version of the food hub on a wholesale price, or to other clients directly who ask for honey in bulk. And similarly, the community groups can do the same. So community groups can sell surplus potatoes perhaps through the online food hub in order to raise some money to reduce their entrance fees for joining the group, and again improving accessibility for people who might find it financially difficult to do so otherwise. So is this a complex adapted system? I'd like to think so, because we've managed to foster multiple links at multiple levels between different food enabling organizations, and we do multiple different things. The idea was to set up each individual enterprise as being financially independent, so that it can generate enough of its own income, should it need to exist in isolation on its own, but that it gets maximum resilience and mutual benefit by sharing resources with other organizations. And crucially, this is not relying on other organizations. This is being mutually supportive. And in that way, you can create functional redundancy within the system, so that if perhaps Tamar Grow Local ceased to exist, the food hub could come to the fore and still manage things in the same strategic way, because it is not financially dependent upon Tamar Grow Local existing in order to make it work. In order to get this system off the ground, we did need to develop most things simultaneously, which was very tiring. But that was necessary because each individual organization perhaps can't support staff time for the whole of the week. But it does need someone monitoring an email or a phone during the whole of the week. But by joining multiple projects together, you can create a minimal viable salary for somebody. It creates employment density within the system, and it can concentrate that into 4 or 5 people that get jobs and can be there to man the phones and the internet, answer the emails and do the driving on a day-to-day basis. So we've tried to create something that's mutually supportive. And I guess the test of that is when a crisis hits. And so COVID is perhaps the biggest crisis that we've had. We also, before COVID, had a cafe, and we were also using the cafe to create ready meals from seasonal gluts locally. And we're on the cusp of getting a contract to supply those seasonal healthy ready meals into a hospital. But COVID put an end to that. We had to close the cafe, with it the ready meal production, and we rather quickly scaled up the food hub side of things to cater to the increased demand for home food delivery. We scaled by 500% in 3 weeks. And we couldn't have done that without the level of commitment from our community group members, volunteers. It's those intangibles which we didn't really know were there until we put out a call for them. And we were able to scale that quickly. And as a result of that, 2 years on, the food hub is perhaps a bit dominant within our ecosystem. Perhaps if the food hub were to fail now, that might have a significant impact on the resilience of the whole organization. But as time goes on, we hope that we can de-risk that by creating more projects that stand alone. And I think that's me done. I'm very willing to answer questions.